There is a moment, right before a woman decides whether to open up to you, that you have felt 100 times and never once noticed. It happens fast, usually inside a small pause that lasts less than 2 seconds, and it decides more about how the rest of the conversation goes than anything either of you says out loud. You have already been in that moment more times than you can count. You just never learn to see it. Most men miss this because they are focused on the wrong thing. You have spent years searching for the right question, the clever question, the one that will finally get her talking. But a question is only the surface of something much deeper. What determines whether she opens up or pulls back has almost nothing to do with the words you choose. So here is what we are going to figure out together. Why do some men ask a simple question and get a woman talking for 20 minutes, while other men ask the exact same question and watch her shut down completely? By the time this video ends, you will see that moment clearly, every single time it happens. You have probably asked a woman a perfectly reasonable question and watched her answer get shorter, not longer. Maybe it was over dinner. Maybe it was late in a phone call. Maybe it was one of those in-between moments where the conversation had been flowing easily and then suddenly wasn't. You asked something that seemed harmless enough, and instead of leaning in, she leaned back. Here is what most men assume happened. They assume the question itself was wrong, so the next time they try to fix it by softening the wording, or picking a safer topic, or avoiding anything that sounds too personal. Of course, wording matters to some degree. A clumsy question can land badly no matter the timing, but that is rarely the real problem. The real problem is almost always sequence, not content. Now you might be thinking, couldn't she just have been busy or in a bad mood, nothing more? And sometimes, yes, that's exactly what it is. But here is the detail that separates a bad mood from a real pattern. A bad mood fades with time, while a mistimed question tends to produce the same shrinking response again and again across completely different women in completely different settings. Think back to a conversation that once seemed ordinary, one where you walked away without realizing what had actually just happened. Somewhere in that exchange, you likely asked something meaningful before she had decided the conversation was a place where meaningful things were welcome. It is not that she didn't want to answer. It is that she wasn't ready to answer yet, and readiness is invisible if you don't know what you're looking for. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional pacing. The idea that intimacy has to be built in a sequence the other person can follow, not delivered all at once. When that pacing is skipped, even a gentle question can feel like a demand. A question that would have felt natural 5 minutes later can feel intrusive the moment it's asked too soon. This does not mean every short answer is a rejection. Sometimes she is simply tired, distracted, or thinking about something unrelated entirely. One instance means very little on its own. But when the pattern repeats, when good questions keep landing flat across different women, different settings, different moods, that repetition is telling you something specific about timing, not about you. Most men respond to that shorter answer by backing off entirely, deciding the topic itself is off limits, and quietly filing it away as a mistake never to repeat. That reaction is understandable. It is also exactly backwards. That answer starts with something that happens before either of you says a single word. Long before you ask anything meaningful, she has already answered a quieter question in her own head. Is this safe yet? You never hear that question out loud. You only see its answer playing out in small, easy-to-miss ways across the first few minutes of any real conversation. Researchers who study emotional safety in conversation describe two broad states a person can be in while talking to someone new, settled, or guarded. A settled woman has decided, at least for now, that this exchange is not going to cost her anything. Her sentences run longer. She adds small, unprompted details. Where she grew up, a story about a friend, an opinion she didn't need to share but chose to. A guarded woman, by contrast, keeps her answers efficient. She gives you exactly what was asked and nothing more, and she tends to redirect the conversation back toward you faster than feels natural, almost like she's holding the door only partway open. Here is the detail most men never notice. These two states are not fixed. A woman can walk into a conversation guarded and become settled within 10 minutes, or she can start settled and become guarded the moment something feels slightly off. Of course, context always matters here. A long day, a public setting, a recent bad experience with someone else entirely can shift where she starts. But the shift itself follows a pattern you can actually watch for. Picture a specific scene. You're a few minutes into a conversation, and she starts turning her body slightly more toward you. Her sentences lengthen, and she laughs at something small before you've even finished the sentence. That is settling in real time. Now picture the opposite. Her answers get clipped. She checks her phone once without needing to, and she starts asking you more questions than she's answering. That is guarding in real time, and it is not personal. It is simply her system deciding moment to moment how much of herself is currently welcome here. Most men either miss this shift entirely, treating every conversation the same regardless of what her signals are actually telling him, or they notice something is off and immediately assume they've already ruined it. Neither response is accurate. The guarded state is not a locked door. It is a door that opens gradually in response to how the conversation is paced, not in response to a single clever line. There is also a timing detail worth noting. Settling and guarding are not stable states. They move back and forth several times within a single conversation, especially early on, and that back and forth is normal rather than alarming. If you catch only one frame of that movement, you might misread the whole picture. What matters is not any single moment, but the general direction things are trending. This is also where most men make a quiet miscalculation. They treat one guarded moment as proof the conversation has failed, when it might simply be a normal dip in an otherwise settling exchange. The goal was never to keep her permanently settled without a single flicker of guard. The goal is to notice the direction and let your pacing follow it rather than fight it. Once you can see that shift happening, the next step is knowing exactly where to walk in. Every woman who has ever opened up to a man did it in stages, even if the whole conversation lasted 6 minutes. It rarely looks like a slow climb from the outside. It feels more like a single flowing conversation. But underneath that flow, there is almost always a ladder, and each rung has to be climbed in order. The first rung is low stakes and observational. Questions here are easy to answer without any real exposure. What she does for work, how she knows the people around her, what she thinks about the place you're both standing in. These questions carry almost no emotional weight, and that is exactly their purpose. They are not meant to reveal anything deep. They are meant to establish a rhythm of back and forth that feels comfortable so that both of you build a small track record of low-risk exchange before anything bigger is asked. The second rung introduces mild personal opinion, not facts about her life, but her actual take on something. What she loves about her work, what she'd change about where she lives, something she feels strongly about, but wouldn't call private. This rung asks her to reveal a little more of herself, not secrets, but preference and personality, still safe, but requiring a small amount of trust that didn't exist on the first rung. The third rung is where real intimacy lives, questions about meaning, feeling, or personal history. What she actually wanted to do before life pointed her somewhere else. A moment that changed how she sees relationships, what she's genuinely proud of but rarely says out loud. These are the questions men are usually most eager to ask because they produce the kind of answer that actually tells you who someone is. Here is the mistake that undoes almost everyone. Men skip straight to rung 3, sometimes within the first few minutes of meeting someone, because the question itself feels perfectly reasonable and even thoughtful. And it is reasonable in isolation. The problem was never the question. The problem is that trust hadn't been built yet to carry a question of that weight. And without rungs 1 and 2 beneath it, rung 3 doesn't feel intimate. It feels sudden. Of course, this doesn't mean every conversation needs the same careful pace. Some connections genuinely move faster, and a woman who's already settled might skip straight to rung 2 within a minute. The latter isn't about rigid timing measured in minutes. It's about earned trust, which can be earned quickly or slowly, depending on the two people involved. Picture how this plays out. On rung 1, you might ask what brought her to this event tonight, a simple doorway question. On rung 2, once the rhythm feels easy, you might ask what she actually enjoys about her work, beyond the job description, a small window into preference. On rung 3, once she's offered a little of herself without hesitation, you might ask what she's learned about herself in the last few years that she wouldn't have guessed earlier, a question that invites reflection, not just information. Notice something about that sequence. Each rung uses the answer from the one before it as its foundation, rather than jumping to a new topic entirely. When a man skips a rung, it's usually because he changes the depth and the subject at once, doubling the sense of sudden exposure, even if his intention was simple curiosity. One more thing worth mentioning, the latter doesn't only apply to a first conversation, it resets in smaller form every time things shift into new emotional territory, a new topic, a new day. A woman who opened up easily last week isn't automatically starting from rung 3 today. She may need a brief pass back through rung 1 before the deeper rungs feel available again, and that isn't regression. It's simply how trust reestablishes itself, which brings up the mistake almost every man makes, usually without realizing it in the moment. There is a specific kind of question that feels caring to the man asking it and feels like an interrogation to the woman answering it. It is not rude. It is not inappropriate. It is simply early white, and the timing is what turns warmth into pressure. The first pattern worth naming is what we can call the depth jump. This is when a conversation is still comfortably on rung 1 and a man suddenly asks something like, "What's the biggest thing you're looking for in a relationship right now?" On its own, that is not an unreasonable question. Plenty of women would happily answer it later. But asked before any real trust has been built, it lands less like curiosity and more like an audit. The corrected version keeps the same intent but respects the sequence, something closer to, "What's been the best part of your week so far?" A question that still opens the door to something personal, without demanding she hand over something she hasn't decided to share yet. The second pattern is what you might call the emotional excavation, a question that reaches directly for a wound before any safety has been established. Something like, "What's the hardest thing that's ever happened to you?" Even asked gently, even asked with good intentions, a question like this assumes an intimacy that hasn't been earned. It can feel less like connection and more like being asked to hand over something private to a stranger. The corrected version waits for her to gesture toward that territory herself and follows her lead rather than leading her there. Something closer to noticing when she mentions a hard season in her life and simply asking what that time taught her rather than opening the wound directly yourself. The third pattern is subtler, and it's the one most men don't even recognize as a mistake, the compliment that functions as a demand. Something like, "You seem like you don't let people see the real you. I bet there's so much more to you than this." It sounds observant. It might even be true. But structurally, it tells her what she is and then waits for her to prove or disprove it, which puts her in a defensive position disguised as flattery. The corrected version offers observation without a verdict attached. Something like, "You seem really thoughtful about how you answer things," a comment that leaves room for her to reveal more or not without any pressure either way. Now you might be thinking, isn't this all just about being more careful with words? Not exactly. The words in the corrected versions aren't softer or vaguer. They are simply placed correctly in the sequence, asked once trust has had a chance to build rather than skipping ahead of it. The same sentence that feels intrusive on rung 1 can feel warm and welcome on rung 3 once she's already chosen to let you closer. Remember what I told you at the start, that some men ask the exact same question as another man and get a completely different result. This is most of the answer right there. It was never really about the question in isolation. It was about whether the sequence around it had earned the right to carry that particular weight. One instance of any of these patterns doesn't ruin anything permanently. A generally settled, trusting woman can absorb an early depth jump without much cost and simply redirect the conversation herself. But repeated across multiple conversations, these patterns quietly train a man to believe women are simply guarded or difficult when the real lesson was about pacing all along. This is more than anything the mistake that keeps thoughtful, well-meaning men stuck at the surface of conversation after conversation, wondering what they're doing wrong when the honest answer was never about effort or sincerity at all. Which leads to the one question most men never think to ask at all. Of course, no single question works on every woman in every mood, but there is one that comes closest, and almost no man ever thinks to ask it. Most questions men ask, even good ones, are built to extract information. What do you do? Where did you grow up? What happened with your last relationship? All of these ask her to hand something over. The question we're talking about now does the opposite. It asks her to discover something in the moment alongside you, rather than retrieve something she already had prepared. It sounds something like this. What surprised you most about yourself this year? Not what happened to you, not what you did. What surprised you about who you turned out to be? Notice the shift. This is not a question she can answer from memory the way she answers where she's from. She has to actually think in real time sitting across from you, and that thinking is not private. You get to witness it happening. Psychologists call this kind of question generative because it produces a new thought rather than retrieving an old one. And there is something quietly significant about being the person present when someone generates a new realization about themselves. It does not feel like being interviewed. It feels like being accompanied. This is also why it lowers her guard more effectively than almost anything else. A retrieval question puts her in the position of deciding how much to reveal, which is exactly the kind of decision that can feel exposing on the wrong rung. A generative question puts both of you in the same position instead. Neither of you knows exactly what she'll say until she says it, which removes the sense that she's being evaluated on her answer. You might be wondering whether a question like this only works late in a conversation, once you're already on the higher rungs of the ladder. Mostly, yes. A generative question aimed too early can feel just as sudden as any depth jump because it still asks for real reflection. But placed where it belongs, after the rungs beneath it have been climbed, it tends to land differently than almost anything else you could ask because it doesn't feel like a question at all. It feels like being invited to think out loud with someone who's actually listening. That is the moment most men walk away from without realizing it. They spend the whole conversation trying to learn things about her, when the far more powerful move was to give her a moment to learn something about herself, with you sitting right there as it happened. This is what closes the loop we opened at the very beginning, why the exact same words can produce two completely different results depending on the man asking them. It was never the script. It was whether he understood what stage of trust he was standing in and whether the question matched it, which is exactly where this comes full circle. So here's what all of this actually comes down to. It was never really about finding better questions. It was about understanding where you stood with someone and letting your questions match that stage instead of racing ahead of it. Every signal, every rung, every pattern we walked through tonight points back to one simple truth. Intimacy is built, not extracted. You don't need to overanalyze every conversation from here forward, replaying each sentence looking for hidden meaning. That would defeat the entire purpose. What you need is a quieter kind of awareness, a sense of the ground you're standing on with her, and the patience to let a conversation arrive somewhere real instead of forcing it there. I want to ask you something, and I read every comment. What's one moment where you asked the right question at the wrong time? And what do you think would have happened if you'd waited? If this gave you a clearer way of seeing conversations you're already having, subscribing means you won't miss what comes next. Next time, we look at the specific phrases that make a woman feel unsafe enough to end a conversation early, even when nothing was said wrong.